manning our finances. Next to him is Diana Okia Flavian Nandudu, who heads our legal team. Behind, Richard Kuriamsima, one of our staff members, and the rest, the first objective. The second objective is to study and analyze quantitatively the data about violations and abuses of media freedoms for the year 2021, so as to establish main trends on press freedoms by looking at the political, social, technological, and economic factors. And the other objective is to identify and highlight key press freedom violations and abuses, their perpetrators as well as the victims. And the fourth one is to show through personal testimonies the impact of violations and abuses on journalists and the practice of journalism in this country, Uganda. Lastly, the fifth one is to make recommendations to relevant stakeholders on the way forward. And the methodology for compiling this report and the development and the compilation of this report for the year 2021 relied on a combination of research methods. Initially, a desk review of primary sources of literature was undertaken mainly to understand the political, legal, economic, technological, and social environment in Uganda and its impact or their impact on press freedom. In addition, secondary sources of literature constituting of newspaper articles, journals, and press freedom reports were reviewed to provide context and understanding of the exercise and enjoyment of press freedom and practice in Uganda. In-depth interviews were also conducted with key individual members of the media fraternity, industrial regulators, owners of media houses, individual journalists, and media rights practitioners. Media rights promoters and defenders and members of the academia were also interviewed in the bid of compiling this report. Then the structure of the report is structured in a way that it has 4 chapters. One is the introduction and context of the study, which provides current state of press freedom in Uganda and clarifies on the methodology, objectives, and structure of the 2021 Press Freedom Index. Chapter 2 looks at the political, legal, economic, and technological environment in Uganda and its impact on press freedom in the year 2021. It further elaborates on the implications with elaborative case studies of what transpired in 2021. Chapter 3 looks at the general nature of violations and abuses of the right to freedom of the press in Uganda. In this respect, the chapter documents the manifestation of human rights violations and abuses committed against journalists and media houses in the year 2021. It also considers the emerging and persistent trends of threats to the practice of journalism in Uganda over the years. Chapter 4 constitutes the list of recommendations and conclusions. And this report of the year 2021 started against the backdrop of one of the most heated and highly politically charged presidential and parliamentary elections in Uganda's history. Towards the end of the previous year, which is 2020 in this regard, the Media Council of Uganda issued a notice requiring all journalists and media practitioners interested in covering the elections and government events to obtain accreditation. Shortly thereafter, the Inspector General of Police cautioned journalists against covering elections without obtaining accreditation, saying that by doing so, they would be putting themselves in harm's way. Although the accreditation requirement was not strictly enforced as threatened, it had several implications for the practice of journalism and the media freedom in several areas of the country. For this reason, it was challenged before courts of law, which declared it a null and void intervention by the Media Council and by the regulators. This success notwithstanding, journalists and media practitioners were subjected to several forms of human rights abuses in the period leading to, during, and immediately after the elections. At the forefront of these abuses were the Uganda Police Force and the Uganda People's Defense Forces, who arrested, detained, assaulted journalists covering the electoral process without a just cause. Journalists were also denied access to major events and venues. Some lost their equipment at the hands of the overzealous security officers and politicians or their supporters. Still, in the same context of the elections, the government shut down the internet and social media on the eve of polling day. The shutdown, which lasted for 5 days, made it difficult for the media to report on elections, on events happening across the country in real time. As a result, the general public was denied timely access to information in respect to voting and tallying processes, a critical element of electoral democracy. Still, in respect to the internet, the government, let alone in the year, introduced a 12% tax on usage, making access to the internet even more difficult and unaffordable for many Ugandans, thereby limiting the access and dissemination of information. Moreover, at the end of the year, 2021, access to Facebook in Uganda remained blocked. Beyond the election period, journalists and media practitioners were victims of brutal attacks from the army in the course of practicing their chosen profession. One clear example is at the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, where some journalists had gone to cover the National Unity Platform presidential candidate, Robert Kyagulanyi, filing a complaint in respect to the alleged kidnaps of his supporters. The journalists were severely beaten in broad daylight by the members of the army. After wide criticism, the soldiers involved were reportedly, in capital letters, tried and sentenced by the Military Police Unit Disciplinary Committee, called the UDC. However, their commander was not tried. A court case was filed challenging the actions of the soldiers, but this was eventually settled by the state after numerous engagements with some of the brutalized victims. We are saying some, because some were not consulted at all. In a further attempt to mend relations and to end hostilities and to rebuild trust between the media and the army, a football match was organized between the two parties. Each of you must have witnessed or even played. Whether it had fruits or not is a discussion for another day. During the year, the press and media continued to endure the brutal effects of the global COVID-19 pandemic. The restrictions imposed in a bid to stop the spread of the pandemic made it difficult for some media houses to generate the revenues necessary to keep them afloat. Record TV, for instance, one of the media houses, was forced to close its operations in Uganda, leading to a loss of over 32 jobs. The print media was not spared either, as it lost critical advertising and saturation sales revenues. Advertisers and candidates vying for political offices resorted to using online platforms, radio, TV, and TV broadcasts, which left the print media struggling. Overall, the COVID-19 related restrictions made it difficult for media houses to operate, and those which remained in business were forced to either downsize their staff or cut payments. This made the situation even more difficult for individual journalists and media practitioners who, for the most part, were already being paid so poorly. Furthermore, the police and the state continued to rely on overly restrictive laws to interfere with the practice of journalism. Several journalists were charged with archaic offenses under the Penal Code Act, even when some of these have since been struck down by the courts of law. The insistence on unrealistic qualifications for accreditation of journalists under the Press and Journalists Act also remained a major impediment for the practice of journalism in Uganda. Although the government finally enacted the much anticipated data protection regulations, placement of the personnel of the Personal Data Protection Office under the NITA Uganda in the regulations threatens its independence. In the same measure, administrative overreach of the UCC in the regulation of the media had a chilling effect and, in some cases, led to some media houses being shut down without a just cause. While it is critical for violations of press freedom rights and freedoms to be addressed, the continued suspension of the DGF, the Democratic Governance Facility, a major funder of media freedom-oriented human rights organizations and justice, law, and order sector government programs, made it difficult for victims to access legal aid and find redress. The continued abuses and violations of press freedom and media rights is responsible for the decline of Uganda's ranking under the World Press Freedom Index from number 117 in 2018, to 125 in 2021. That was a tremendous decline in terms of ranking for Uganda. We now want to present the report by way of statistics, ladies and gentlemen. And so we are breaking down the violations and abuses that we have talked about, which are a total of 131 violations and abuses. So HRNJ Uganda in total recorded a number of 131 cases of human rights abuses and violations against journalists, media practitioners, and media houses, where our team were able to verify and find fitting for our report. This is, of course, a decrease when compared to the number of cases previously recorded in recorded last year, which stood at 174. That is 2020. And also slightly lower than those that were recorded in 2019, which stood at 165. Also slightly lower than those that were recorded in 2018, which stood at 163. But more so, an increase when we refer to those that were recorded in 2017, which stood at 117. So if you compare 2021 and 2017, there's been a slight increase in the cases that were documented. So, in a nutshell, in the last 5 years since 2017, HRNJ has recorded a total of 723 cases of abuses and violations. That is not good news for the media, for such cases to be documented in only a record 5 years. Then here we break down the nature of the violations and abuses and their number of violations. So assault cases stood at 63. Arrested journalists were 26. Those media houses that were switched off were 2. Gadgets that were confiscated and taken away stood at 2. We're talking of 2021. And damaged equipment stood at 6. Those journalists that were really threatened, their lives were really in harm's way, stood at 7. Those that were charged in courts of law stood at 7. It's unprecedented to have 7 journalists charged in courts of law here in Uganda. And those that were blocked from accessing their news stood at 8. Those that were physically attacked stood at 2. Whose footage were deleted stood at 2. Those that were summoned for interrogation stood at 2. Cyber harassment stood at 4. So in total, this accounts for the 131 cases recorded in 2021. When we go down to break down the type of cases, we look at assaults. assaults were the highest number of all the total cases reported, which stood at 63. This was a decrease by 8 cases from those 71 assault cases that were reported in 2020. But it was an increase from those that were recorded in 2019 because they stood at 26. And also those that were recorded in 2018, which stood at 37. And 27 still in 2017. We're trying to project about 5 years and drawing a comparison to see how we're progressing in terms of press freedom in the country. And then those journalists that were arrested, we had them as the second number of violations committed in the year 2021, and they stood at 26. This was a decrease from the 29 cases that were reported in 2020, and 36 that were recorded in 2019, and 31 that were recorded in 2018, and 45 that were recorded in 2017. 2017 had a skyrocketing number of cases of journalists that were arrested. A total number of eight arrest cases were reported during the elections and campaign period. 7 from enforcement of the COVID-19 directives, and 4 of the arrested cases emanated from the charges of defamation and offensive communication, and the rest of the cases were from other incidences. So we look at journalists that were blocked from accessing news. Their number stood at 8 cases involving the blockage and denial of access to journalists from covering different events. This was a drastic decrease from 40 cases that were reported in 2020 and 44 cases that were reported in 2019, as well as in 2018. And then, of course, 11 that were recorded in 2017. The 7 journalists that were threatened, this was the third, of course, the fourth highest type of violation that happened to journalists. And it was an increase of 2 cases from those 5 that were reported in 2020, and an increase by 6 of the one that were reported in 2019. And the same number of cases was reported in 2018. The threats in 2021 were committed against media houses and journalists during mainly the campaign period. Then we had journalists whose equipment was damaged. This stood at 6 cases. And this was a slight decrease from the 8 cameras that were damaged in 2020, 3 that were damaged in 2019, and 5 that were damaged in 2018. And of course, 7 equipment that was damaged in 2017. Then we go to another bit of analyzing the victims of this violation and abuses. A total of 35 violations, that is about 26% of the violations and abuses were recorded against radio stations. So radio stations were mainly targeted in this regard, but they were not the leading one, because 67 cases were against television stations, which stood at 51.1%. So TVs were not safe as well. And 12, which represents 9.1% against print media. And then 17, which represents 12.9% against online media practitioners. In comparison, in 2020, 39.1% were against radio stations and 34% against television stations. So in the reporting year here, more radio stations were targeted as compared to 2020. Then we go down to the perpetrators. In the categories of perpetrators, press freedom violations in 2021, we have the Uganda Police Force, We have the UPDF, Uganda People's Defense Forces. We have the RDCs, the Resident District Commissioners. We have the Special Forces Command, SFC. We have the Regulator, UCC. We have the Chief Administrative Officers, the COWs. And we have members of parliament, members of the community, and some are unknown to us. So we go specifically to each of the perpetrators. Here we touch the Uganda Police Force. The Uganda Police Force has, for the 13th year, emerged as the leading violator of press freedoms in Uganda. A total of 82 cases out of 131 violations reported in 2021 were directly attributed to members of the Uganda Police Force. 43 of the cases emanated from elections and campaign trails, 14 from the enforcement of the COVID-19 control measures, and 13 from the criminal offenses, in bracket that is offensive communication and criminal libel, and 12 from the journalists covering other stories. So the police force has been consistent with violations. For instance, in 2017, they were responsible for 83 of the cases in 2017. In 2018, they were responsible for 87. So the tally went up by 4 cases. In 2019, their cases went up to 101. In 2020, it shot to 104. And now, they're responsible for 82 of the cases in 2021. There's slightly a decline compared to the other years, but still the nature of manifestation means the police is not sleeping on the job when it comes to tormenting journalists. They're not sleeping on the job. Very active. Then we go down to the UPDF, your army, Uganda People's Defense Forces. You are the people. The Uganda People's Defense Forces came second in perpetration of press freedom violations in the year 2021, with a total of 25 violations out of those recorded, which are 131. And the number is slightly lower than the 31 violations that were recorded in 2020. Slightly lower, much as it's high, and they are in the second position. Their numbers certainly gone down a little bit. But it's more than the six recorded in 2019, and 9 in 2018, and 3 in 2017. One time we went and engaged with the army, and these were the statistics that we presented to them, and they could not deny any of the cases. The army's only concern was that in that year's report, we had carried a graphic illustration of the army beating a journalist. And they said, you people are very unfair. The police beats you more. How come you're carrying our photo and not that of the police? So they were very concerned. But we said in news assessment, you weigh in the weight of the offense. Because if it's 5 men descending on a journalist who is putting up his hands, and there's a camera in his the press tag, and you beat him, he's not running away, sure, then nothing can replace such energies that the army used on our colleague, Jime Akena, then, who is now somewhere away in Gulu, trying to do some odd jobs to make a living. Then when we go to the resident district commissioners, RDCs, they were also reported among the other leading perpetrators of press freedom violations in 2021, with 3 cases, of course. This was less than the 13 cases that we recorded in 2020, and 9 cases in 2018, the same cases in 2019. There was certainly a slight improvement registered in here, but still things are not any better when it comes to the RDCs. Then we touch the SFCs, the Special Forces Command. This is a specialized unit that of the UPDF tasked with carrying out special missions in support of the national military objectives. However, these forces have at times deviated from their duties and instead resorted to violating rights of the media practitioners. In 2021, they were responsible for 6 cases of violations which were recorded to their name. Previously, in 2020, only 1 case was reported, while 14 cases were reported against them in 2018. This is not good news still to the guys that go out to the field and are faced with this, or confronted with this specialized force. Then we have the community, people where all of us come from. The community, which all the mob, are also one of the recurrent perpetrators of press freedom abuses in Uganda. They are responsible for 6 cases involving mobs which were recorded in that year. In 2020, we recorded only 7 cases, of course, which certainly is not good news. But in 2019, we recorded 6. We recorded 9 cases in 2018 and 4 cases in 2017. That squarely means that we have to do a lot of work to engage the communities because they're supposed to be our shields. That's where the journalists go to fish for news. So if the communities are going to turn against the journalists, then there's nowhere to run to and hide. In view of all that I have labored to break down for all of us here, this report makes specific recommendations to different sector players. And one of them is the Parliament of Uganda and the Uganda Law Reform Commission. They have a huge task, according to this report, to do. And we have about 7 recommendations to their name. One of them is to re-establish the Personal Data Protection Office as an independent entity and not under NITA Uganda, as it is currently incorporated. Since NITA Uganda is directly under the supervision of the Ministry of ICT, there is a high risk that it will infringe on the independence of the Personal Data Protection Office. So we would like this to be a semi-autonomous office, non-directly under NITA Uganda. 2, to revisit the minimum wages bill that establishes a minimum wage for all employees in the country. This will uplift the welfare of journalists and help to resolve economic exploitation by those who employ the journalists, a situation that has led many of the journalists to resort to unprofessional and exploitative conduct. Sometimes people will complain about journalists, but the cause of the problem is their bosses, and nobody seems to be calling them to order. Not in this room, not elsewhere. Journalists are left to fend for themselves. We started a campaign with my colleague Molondo sometime with the Uganda Human Rights Commission and a number of actors to see how we could bear pressure such that there was an overhaul of how journalists are remunerated in this country. Of course, it's a very challenging task for anyone where most of the politicians own media houses. So they fear to legislate against their businesses. And as such, journalists have been left to fend for themselves. Then we also have a recommendation to amend the Press and Journalists Act to remove current unrealistic qualification requirements for accreditation of journalists. The issue of accreditation should be left to the media houses themselves, as it is the practice in most of the democracies elsewhere. Then we also want or recommend that there is an amendment to the laws that seek to restrict the enjoyment of press rights and freedoms, which include the Penal Code Act, Cap 120, and the Computer Misuse Act. Many journalists today are threatened because of the existence of that law. Once you do what we legally look at as our work, somebody is out there complaining that you're misusing the computer because you're doing literally what you're supposed to do as a professional. Then we also want the enactment of laws that protect journalists against harassment, especially the female colleagues in the field, both online and offline. This is necessary to address the escalating cases of cyberbullying, sexual and physical violence against female journalists. Recently, you saw a conversation where many online people were attacking journalists. Midwife Haise of NBS was always attacked. there's Mr. Kanre Mugume, there's Daniel Rutaya. If you're following what is happening online, you really see that there's a lot of this cyberbullying and harassment of especially the female colleagues out in the field. Then we also recommend to the President and the Judicial Service Commission to reinstate full access to all social media platforms and desist from future internet interruptions. Current blockages on platforms such as Facebook limit the dissemination of news, restrict citizen journalism, and block journalistic sources. To date, when you say person operating on Facebook, you just know that they have bypassed. So such a tribunal, the media